Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Defending the Early Years 2020 Virtual Institute. I want to start by introducing one of Defending the Early Years co-founder, Nancy Carlson Page, to offer some brief remarks.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me. It's a new world here, the virtual world. I'm getting used to it. I wish I could see you, but I know you're there. And I see your chats, people from all over the country. It's a big thrill, and I'm honored to be able to welcome you to this institute. There are hundreds of you, and we're thrilled about that. We're at an amazing moment in history. We have the convergence of two pandemics, the COVID-19 last pandemic of the last 6 months or so, and the many hundreds years of the other pandemic of racism coming together to bring about a moment of opportunity for us, for reflection and for change, and for thinking about how we want to be at this time in history and what we can do to the benefit of all of us, and especially young children. We started Defending the Early Years in 2012, and we started it with the purpose of speaking out against what was this influx of demands for academic standards in the early grades and testing that we were all so concerned about. And we wanted to get a stronger voice. You know, our field is fragmented, as you know, and we tried to bring people together to get a sort of a stronger, more uniform voice about these pressures that we felt were so unhealthy for young kids. And since then, we still are concerned about that, and we still speak out about it, but we've also taken on a lot of other issues that have occurred in kids' lives and in the society since 2012. I was listening to an interview with the great civil rights leader, John Lewis, who died last Friday, and I listened to an interview yesterday, and he was saying when he was growing up, his mother told him, be a good boy and don't get in the way. And he said, but I say, if you want to be part of history, you have to get in the way. And I think that's what we've been doing at Defending the Early Years for these last 8 years. We've been trying to get in the way of any social issues, events, occurrences that we think are unhealthy for young kids, working against young kids. So if it's Common Core standards that get determined without the voices of early childhood teachers at all, we object. Or if it's the loss of play in classrooms, especially classrooms of low income children and kids of color, we speak out about it. Or if it's online preschool education that's getting marketed as a legitimate substitute for quality in-person education, we speak up about that. Or if it's social protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, we figure out a way to explain it to young kids in a way that they can understand. Plus a lot of other actions and efforts that we've done. And if you check out our website, you'll see that you can see what they all are, and hopefully help in some, join in some, share the things we have there. Everything can be downloaded and is free, of course. And on the website, you can also see the names of the amazing educators we work with, because we've rallied so many people to try to strengthen this early childhood voice. We have an amazing National Advisory Board of Early Childhood Leaders. We have an incredible, solid infrastructure leadership team that you can read about, following the direction of our amazing co-directors, Blakely Bundy and Denisha Jones. This conference that we're at now and will be at this week is the brainchild of Denisha. Thank you, Denisha, so much for what you've done. Every single step that we take helps us get more clarity and a stronger voice about how to speak out as an early childhood community for kids. So hopefully that's going to happen plenty from this week. And so let's get started.
Thank you, Nancy, for those opening remarks. I am really honored to be part of the Defending the Early Years and to to put together this conference with your support and the support of Diane and everyone with Blakely and even Jerry Lynn, who was a co-director until recently. It's really quite an honor. So welcome everyone. Yes, as Nancy said, I will take credit. This is my brainchild in a way. When I came on board as a director of early childhood organizing, Nancy and Jerry Lynn and Blakely said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to build policy for early childhood. I want to be a policy advocate for early childhood about policies that matter to us, about what we're not seeing in the broader landscape by the organizations that supposedly represent us. And I want it to come from early childhood teachers in the field. I want to bring them together for a weekend. I want to talk about policy and to talk about advocacy and to do that work. And last year that idea came to a result. We had our first Summer Institute in Washington, D.C., and it was amazing. And this year we were going to do a second institute in Washington, D.C., but of course the COVID-19 has forced us to go virtual, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in my time being at Defending the Early Years, from being on the advisory board to being a blogger to now being co-director with Blakely, I just want to talk a little bit about this amazing organization and the work that we do. Defending the Early Years, as Nancy said, was created by Nancy and Diane to really push back on a lot of the things that they saw were happening that were harming children, harming early childhood education and teachers and families. And so the organization does a lot of things, but just a couple of the things is they create resources, right? Anytime someone asks me, I need some information related to early childhood to tell to an administrator or an elected official, I send them to DEY. We have reports, position papers, fact sheets, videos, and webinars, which are great resources. As Nancy said, for free. Sometimes many of them are translated into Spanish, and we're looking to get them translated into other languages if anyone would like to help with that. We also provide support to promote the work of our allies. Nancy has done webinars with Campaign for Commercial Free Childhood, which we'll hear from Josh later today, who's part of that organization. We support the Network for Public Education, and we're proud to have Diane Ravage as the president of that organization with us today. Badass Teachers, which I'm a part of the administrator of that group. So we promote our work. We provide testimony in support of legislation. There was a bill in Oregon where they were trying to get standardized testing out of the early childhood grades. And though I could not be there, I was able to submit written testimony that could be shared through my role. We provide consultation when possible. We advocate, and we also offer mini grants to people who are looking for funds to do things related to early childhood and related to play. Again, all of this information can be found on our website. And we also organize. I first got involved with Defending the Early Years when I went to a NACCE annual conference meeting. It was in DC where I lived. And I was just perusing the list of all the NACCE events. And I saw this early childhood organizing meeting. And I was like, what? We have early childhood people who are organizing? And I went, and it was Nancy and Jerry Lynn and Susan Oxshorn was there and some other folks. And I spoke out about Badass Teachers, United Opt Out, and other groups. And they immediately welcomed me into their space and brought me into the work that they were doing. So each year we host an organizing meeting at the NACCE conference because it's a good way to meet other early childhood people in the field who are interested in organizing as well. We have the DEY Summer Institute. This is going to be an annual thing. This is the second one, but we're going to keep doing this as well. And at the end of this institute, we're hoping to launch some working groups. We know that people want to be more involved. Whenever I go and talk about my role in defending the early years and early childhood advocacy, people are like, well, how can we get involved? We're not a membership organization, so other than utilizing our resources, people want to do more. So we thought about the idea of working groups, and we'll be talking about over the next 4 days, and we hope to launch those after as well. So I just wanted to give you that overview. You'll also see a little bit about some of the reports, some photos we put together that really document a lot of the work that we do at Defending the Early Years. So I want to start talking briefly as well about our goal for this institute. Again, we had planned to bring people together in Washington, D.C. to do some advocacy work. Eventually, long-term dreams were to have people lobbying on the Hill for advocating on the Hill with their elected officials. Given that the impact of COVID-19 and we've had to gone virtual, we thought it was really important to get together a diverse group of speakers from a range of areas to talk about early childhood education, but also through the lens of the two pandemics that Nancy mentioned, right? Both COVID-19, but also through the pandemic of racism, right? Because that's not gone away, as we learned during COVID-19 and through the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others as well. So we want to continue that conversation. But we want to make it clear that, you know, Defending the Early Years as an organization doesn't believe that it's our position to tell 50 states and every school district and community in that state how and when they should reopen. We believe that schools will reopen and should reopen when it is safe to do so. And that safety takes into a lot of factors, right? It takes into the infection rate and the death rate in your community. And we also think teachers need to feel safe to return, parents need to feel safe to send their children, and children also need to feel safe to go. And we know that that's a lot to look at. There's a lot of different factors. Personal safety is involved, community safety is involved, and we recognize that. So you're going to hear from a lot of diverse people talking about that, and they might have their own views, right? We have Michelle Gunderson, who's a first grade teacher, who's going to think differently about what it means to go back to the schools today, right? I'm a college professor, and I'm preparing students to do student teaching in a world that's not what we're used to, right? So I have my own views on that, and everyone's going to have their say. And we just want you to know we feel like we can offer some guidelines and have this discussion really rich, but we're by no means telling school districts what to do, because we think it's a decision that needs to be made at the local level with parents, with teachers, and with community members together, right? So I just wanted to make that clear for you. So today, our first panel, we are looking at lessons learned from the response to COVID-19, protecting early childhood education. And we have Nancy Carlson-Page, who you just heard from. We also have the wonderful Diane Ravage. We have Michelle Gunderson, who I mentioned is a first grade Chicago teacher. We have Jim St. Clair, who is a retired kindergarten teacher and a DEY board member. We have Josh Golan, who works for the Campaign for Commercial Free Childhood, and myself, Denisha Jones, as your moderator for today. So I just want to go over the plan. We have a question for each panelist, and I will ask them the question, and we will post the question in the chat. They will speak for a while, and then we'll open it up for another panelist to respond to their question. And then after we've gone through each panelist and gone through the 5 questions, we will then open it up for Q&A. We ask that you please use the Q&A function to post your questions. It's really hard to follow the chat when there are 192 people talking at the same time. So we do have someone helping us with that. But again, please use the Q&A function if you want to ask a question. And we will do our best to ask 4 to 5 questions during the Q&A at the end. And given this virtual way, we can't get to know you the way we would if we were in DC at the Eaton Hotel. You would have went around in small groups. You would have told us about yourself. So we created a poll. I don't know if you're familiar with polls in Zoom, but right now you should see a poll on your screen, and it's asking where you're currently located. And I have a couple different options. So if you could please go ahead and put in your response to the poll, and we'll be able to come back and see those when you're done. While you're doing that, I just want to say a couple things. Thank you to our people who are doing the behind the scenes tech stuff, Giro Studios. We've worked with, they were actually a part of our first institute where they helped film it and make some videos. And they've also done other recordings with us. So they're based in Boston. And so we want to thank Giro and Felicia and their studio team for really helping with the logistics as well today. We also want to remind you again to use the Q&A function to complete the poll, and that we'll do questions at the end. I did see some comments. Yes, you'll be hearing a lot of Ella Jenkins in the next 4 days. I couldn't think of the best music to play and thought, why not listen to Ella Jenkins? And as Carol mentioned from Wisconsin, she hasn't heard it since she left the classroom, right? And I can only imagine how that feels. All right, so we've got some of the results are coming in. The United States and the Northeast is heavily represented, but all of the United States is represented, which is great. I'm not seeing a lot of folks on the in other countries, and we've gotten messages from people that they want to participate, but it's of course late at night. And so we are recording this session. We're also streaming it on Facebook Live right now from the Defending the Early Years page, if you know someone who could not join in. We will make the recordings available to everyone who registered from our private YouTube as well. All right, with that being said, let's get started with our first question directed to Nancy Carlson-Page. So Nancy, as you know, as you mentioned, right, all of this stuff is happening right now around COVID-19. And so I wanted us to talk a little bit about how can we support parents and teachers and young children who've been historically disadvantaged by the inherent inequities in our child care and public education system, given that they're facing more inequities because of COVID-19.
Exactly. COVID-19. Thank you very much, Denisha. Yeah, COVID-19 has made glaringly visible the inequities in our society that have been here for hundreds of years, but we're just seeing them so incredibly dramatically now with the effects of this COVID pandemic. The inequities in society that are more long-lasting affect parents and children and teachers and pervade our field as well. So many of us who work with young kids see the unequal start that children get in this world. I can never think of the right adjective for what I want to say about the poverty rate in this country. It's a wealthy country, really loads of money. I'm sure everyone knows that. It's in the pockets of 1% of the people, but there's a lot of money in the government as well and in the military bills. And anyway, it doesn't go to young kids. We have 1 out of 6 children who live in poverty, and 73% of those are kids of color. So we see, those of us who work with young kids, we know, we see the advantages that having a family of means offers. Kids have a sense of security, they have stability, there's less stress on the family, they have time and attention from parents, they have toys to play with, they have books, and there are people who can read the books, and on and on. And these advantages that kids of means have carry on into school because of our really fragmented field. There are a lot of very wonderful early childhood programs that parents who can afford tuition for send their children to. Probably a good chunk of you teach in programs like this, and they're wonderful programs. It's just that they're not accessible to everybody, and that's something we really want. Beautiful sort of progressive preschools that are play-based that children get to go to offer enormous opportunities for creative learning and for healthy development for young children. And it's a very different story for kids of low income, because if they go to preschools, they're usually preschools that are publicly funded. And unfortunately, when there's public money, there are strings attached. That's one of the awful spillovers of the ed reform movement, Race to the Top, the early learning grants that tied standards and testing to the funding that supported preschool programs that were public. So I've seen these programs. There's no comparison between what a young child gets who's 3 or 4 or 5 in a preschool that's standards and testing driven versus one that's progressive and creative. So across the board, we actually see, because of this ed reform era, over the last gradually 20 years, preschools and kindergartens and first grades with less and less play, with less child choice, with more teacher-directed instruction, more worksheets, less arts and music, vastly less play. And research shows us that it's in low-income communities with children of color where these sort of harsh approaches to early learning exist most. There are profound effects on children who go to programs like that. Effects in terms of how children learn, effects in terms of what they learn, and also what they learn about learning. Do they love to be there? Do they love to learn? Do they learn to love school? Or do they start to feel at a really young age, this isn't for me? And people who talk about the school to prison pipeline often now talk about the preschool to prison pipeline, because we see that alienation occur with our very youngest kids now in a lot of the kinds of programs we send them to. And that's something we've been speaking out about, and we will always continue to, and can always use the help of every other educator who wants to advocate for high quality preschool. We call for universal high quality pre-K at Defending the Early Years. But we worry about that because in this climate of standards and testing and really a complete redefinition of what education is, instead of play-based, creative, fostering independent, original thinking, and all the things that I think of it as, and many of you do too, I'm sure, has gotten defined much more narrowly to mean accomplishing answers of discrete pieces of information. And unfortunately, in a climate like that, it's much harder to advocate for quality preschool, because we have to explain what that means. So we try to use words like experiential and activity-based and play-based, but it's often a longer conversation. And one of our biggest tasks, all of us, is to push for universal quality pre-K, we believe, but we have to explain to local leaders, people at the state level, local decision makers, what that looks like, and resist the kind of shortcut approaches that are often in the wings. I got to finish, but we have also inequalities in our own field that we have to grapple with, and this is a moment when we can begin to do that. We have a racial wage gap. White teachers receive much higher wages than Black and brown teachers. We have more professional development opportunities and leadership roles for white teachers than teachers of color. These are things we need to look at within the field and in our own spheres and our own communities of influence. We have to ask ourselves, is this happening, and why, and what can we do about it? The People of Color Caucus of NAEYC issued a manifesto recently calling for an elimination of the racial gap in the profession. So sort of to capture this idea of the wage gap and the professional advancement gap. And you can go on to the NAEYC website and you can sign this as a first step, but hopefully then also begin to also commit yourself to hopefully to looking at these hard issues in your own program. We have another kind of discrimination in our field that we have to grapple with. You probably know, but for years, we've had, for decades actually, we've had really high suspension rates of preschoolers. It's hard to believe I always think who's suspending a preschooler, but in fact, thousands of kids are getting suspended every year from preschools. I think one contributing factor is the very difficult and confining academic situation that young kids are put in that they literally cannot handle. And they need to be able to play and move actively. And a lot of these problems would be resolved if kids could have a developmentally appropriate, healthy preschool to go to, and not one that asks them to sit there and listen to a teacher's direct instruction. But there is another factor, and there is racial discrimination in our field. We need to deal with it. We need professional development, I feel committed to, that is for all teachers, but primarily white teachers who need help reflecting on their own biases about racial difference. And also they need help in getting, in understanding how those biases affect the ways that they perceive children from different backgrounds. And teachers then need strategies and tools to be able to work with kids instead of using authority power over them that results in suspensions, instead of letting kids find ways with teachers that are creative and helpful and let them stay in school and continue to love to play and to learn. So that said, I don't know if it was 10 minutes because I wasn't clocking it, I'm sorry. I hope you interrupt me if I go on too long, but okay.
You did fine, Nancy. Thank you so much. I am watching the clock, and we'll do our best to keep it to the time, but okay. For sure. So thank you so much. I think what you said so much that's so important. I do want to open it up to another panel member to offer a response, but I just think part of what you're saying, it's just this mindset that we have that if children come together and they don't know the same thing, then it's our job to bring up the other ones up to speed. Like we see children starting as a deficit, right? You come together and some kids know their colors and some kids know their name, their letters, and if they don't, then that's a problem. And instead of saying, let's all let them start where they're at and bring them together and not see it as such a deficit. And we do this especially with low-income children and children of color, as you mentioned, right? And so that's when you're being told then, oh no, poor children and children of color need rigor and need worksheets and need obedience training because they don't know these things, instead of saying now is the space to welcome everybody from where they are, and to give them the knowledge and give them the skills, right? So I think it's a mindset shift that we have a hard time embracing when we see children. Like, I don't see a children as being behind. Oh, you don't know your color. Okay, let's work on that. We can get you to know your colors. Or what do you do know? Right? Like, you know a lot of things. Like, you know a lot of things you've learned from your family, about your culture. And why don't we start with there about what you do know, and what you like and what you're interested in. So I'll stop there. I know everyone's back, and I want to open it up and see if anybody else would like to, any of the panelists would like to give a response to Nancy and to her question.
Denise, it's Michelle. Nancy, thank you so much for that. And I think we also need to be thinking about the technology divide and the access for our children, because even though I'm a play-based teacher, my children see me now and probably ongoing in the fall through technology. And many of our students don't have it or the bandwidth to be working with their teacher. And I think we need to be advocating, as much as we don't want screen-based work, we do need to be connected to one another.
It's all we have right now. You know, I'm not a big fan of using screens with children, but if this is what we have, this is the way we can see each other. You and I right now, we can see each other. It's better than nothing, and it's what we need to use during this time.
Just one quick comment is that when we use screens, we need to think about how we use them. That so most of what happens now is very, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So much of what you hear now is, you know, this kind of rote teaching and lessons and so forth, and how to use screens in ways that help children and parents get involved in ways that connect to learning in their environment, that don't just use screens, that get them away from screens, that really encourage them, as when we're talking about young children especially, to do things in the real world and not just think being involved with screens is all they can do in these times. I mean, the one group I want to mention that is now almost is 20 years old, over 20 years old, that I founded because of this very issue, was Teachers Resisting Unhealthy Children's Entertainment, and it's listed online, but truceteachers.org. And some of us involved here were very involved with it, but it has a whole list of materials called family play plans, and it talks about what are kids learning from these plans, guides for, you know, different ways to make toys, very simple open-ended toys children can use in the house. And we're talking again about young children, like up to age about 6, 7. And, you know, the idea that somehow if parents are busy, these family play plans can help children get involved in things so that parents can do other things. And it doesn't involve buying a lot of expensive things or using a lot of screens.
Thanks, Diane. That's definitely an important point to mention as well, too. All right, well, let's keep the conversation going. I know you might have something else to say, but hopefully you can work that into your next question. So I want to bring in Diane Ravitch, who is our lovely resident historian of education. A lot of people are talking about this idea that, you know, kids are they're getting left behind, you know, they need to be in school, they're not learning. And I think, you know, that's true, but, you know, what can we learn from history about overcoming disruptions to schooling, right? Because this is not the first time that schooling's been disrupted. You know, it's the first time in many of our lifetimes, but we know that this has happened before. So I wanted to know if you could speak to a little bit about that.
Sure, I'd be glad to do that. I have not studied the previous pandemics, but your request for me to do so sent me back to the books and Googling, and what I discovered I think is relevant to our time. I'm interested, and I follow the work of DEY because, first of all, I'm a mother, but most importantly right now I'm a grandmother, and I have been very, very upset about the totally inappropriate focus on standardized testing for young children. I'm also upset about the standardized testing emphasis for older children because I think the standardized tests are very misleading, and they derive entirely from IQ testing, which was tied to the eugenics movement. And there was a very large degree of eugenics thinking and racism embedded in standardized testing. And back in the 1920s, when the standardized tests were first popularized, um, they were used to make comparisons amongst ethnic and racial groups, as to say which was superior. And it was all ridiculous and phony because they were testing culture and claimed that they were testing inherent intelligence, which was not true. It was not true then, and it's not true now. So my major concern with young children today is the inappropriate pressing down into the early grades and way before first grade of standardized testing. So you forced me to go back to the history books and also in this age, Googling, because the history books don't say much about pandemics. And the biggest pandemic before our time was the what's called the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. And it probably didn't start in Spain. It started apparently, from what I've read, in Fort Riley, Kansas. It was an avian-borne flu. It was the most horrific pandemic that has been recorded. There may have been others in ancient times, like the bubonic plague. But in 1918, 1919, this pandemic spread around the world. It was spread to a large extent by soldiers going to World War I and then returning from World War I. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain was one of the few nations that did not censor the existence of this pandemic. And most other countries tried to play it down and pretend that it didn't exist, which may sound familiar to you. The estimates are that between 30 and 50 million people died worldwide. In the United States, 675,000 people died. It hit communities very hard, and the response in many places was to do pretty much what we're doing today, but based on a lot less knowledge and a lot less science. There was social distancing, although they didn't call it that. There were cities and towns that quarantined those who were sick, and the sickness spread so quickly, and it was so devastating that they often weren't able to quarantine people in time to actually stop the spread of the disease. There was one study that was done of school closings that I was able to find, and that study showed it looked at 43 different cities and found that 41 of the 43 had closed their schools. Some of them did it before the spread before there was any deaths in the community. They just realized quickly that gatherings of people were very dangerous things. So they closed schools. The two biggest cities, New York and Chicago, did not close their schools, but what they did instead was to have very intensive medical inspections. And they seem to have had a far better public health structure than we have today in the schools. There were nurses, there were doctors, there were people checking to see how kids were. And there was also just a lot of what you'd call prophylactic activities to protect children and staff. But in the overview of these studies is the communities who acted most rapidly to close down social activities and to close their schools saw fewer deaths, fewer incidences and rates of death. And there was one comparison that I saw in another article between St. Louis and Philadelphia. Philadelphia decided to more or less ignore the pandemic and pretend that it had already gone away. And St. Louis did not. And St. Louis had a much, much lower rate of infection than Philadelphia did. Philadelphia had a Liberty Loan parade in the middle of the pandemic, which spread it. But in general, the pandemic was reached into small towns, it reached into rural areas. And part of this was because there were soldiers coming back home and bringing the disease with them. But it was a devastating pandemic. And I might add that in contrast to today, there was no effort to politicize the pandemic. Woodrow Wilson himself, who was president at that time, caught the flu and survived it. But there was no effort to say, my way is the only way, and to minimize it. There were places that minimized it, and they paid a price for it. But what happened in schools, for the most part, was they closed down. And I think the other thing that's important to bear in mind about the earlier pandemic was that when it first arrived in different towns and cities and communities, it was a rather mild disease, and people got it, they overcame it. But then it came back 6 months or a year later in the spring of 2019, and it was devastating. It was very much deadlier on the second wave. So that's something that we should bear in mind. I think what's particularly troubling today to me is that the two most important things that we should be attending to seems to have missed the attention of our political leaders. First is that you should not open schools in the midst of a pandemic, that when you're in a state or a city or a region where the cases are surging, that is not the right time to open schools. And the second thing is that even when there's a very low incidence of infections, the schools need to have a lot of extra funding in order to keep both children and adults safe. So if the infection rate has dropped as it has in the Northeast at this point, the schools still need to have social distancing, which means small classes. They need to have the cleaning equipment. They need to have the ventilation systems checked and repaired. They need to have extra teachers for the small classes. They need to have nurses and extra medical personnel. That's all very expensive at a time when budgets are being slashed across the country because of the pandemic. And this is a time where the federal government should be stepping up and providing much more money. And yet our president says that if schools don't open, he's going to cut their budgets even more. So we'll have states cutting the budget, the federal government threatening to cut their budget if he can get away with it. And the last I read, which was this morning at Politico, is that the Senate seems to be ready to go along with the president's proposal to cut school funding if schools don't open. But teachers have been saying, I think pretty consistently, particularly in the hardest hit areas, we're not going to go back to school at risk of our lives and at the risk of the lives of children. We now know that children, from a study in South Korea, we know that children as young as 10 is likely to get the disease as adults are and is likely to spread it. So I think this is a time where we have to say, as painful as distance learning is, as much as parents hate it, as much as children want to be back in school, teachers want to be back in school, what matters most is life and health. And until the funding is available so that schools can be reopened safely, they're not going to be reopened. So I think that's the lessons I take away from what I've learned about the pandemic of 1918, 1919, but also to be wary of the risk of a second wave. And we've been warned about that, and we don't know whether it's going to happen. Maybe we'll be lucky and it won't happen. But it did happen 100 years ago, 101 years ago. And when it did, it was far worse than the first wave. So I think we have to be very much on guard and protect life above all. So that's my contribution. I hope that it's helpful in thinking through these issues, which are obviously things that we all worry about and are very troubled by. And we have to protect our teachers and our school staff just as much as we have to protect the children and resist the political pressures. And I just want to add one thing, which is this morning I read and posted on my blog something that the governor of Missouri said. Governor Parson said, of course children are going to get the COVID and they're not going to go to the hospital. They're going to go home and they'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And he seemed to be quite content to think that every child might get the COVID and it was not a problem. He seems to forget that there are adults working in the schools and that when they get the COVID and they take it home to their families, you're creating a super spreader event. So be cautious, take care, stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. I don't know how to feel about giving you homework, but I'm glad you did it. And I really thought that you would appreciate this question because you have that historical lens that a lot of us don't have, and your responses show that, your diligence in getting at the question and looking at the Spanish flu. And I think, you mentioned really important stuff, that if we rush to reopen, it's just going to get worse, right? And we've learned that history shows us that, and that's why that's so important. And I think we're seeing that right now in some states. I'm in New York, and New York was one of the states early hit hardest, as we all know, as you know, and you're in New York, and now we're coming better, but it took a lot. And other states didn't want to do what New York was doing because it wasn't so big in New York, right? And now it's happening there as well too. So we have we're a little at time, but I do want to open it up to see if any one of the panelists would like to offer a brief response to.
I would like to offer something, Denisha.
Thanks, Jim.
One of the other great disruptors of society is war, and I've always been curious about some of the benefits that came out of World War II in terms of education. I teach in Cambridge, and the neighboring city of Somerville have full-day kindergarten since World War II, and the reason for that was that women had to go work in the industries. And I was very fortunate when I came up that I worked back in the early 70s in what were called open classrooms. But what we based it on was something called the British infant school method, which again was a result of World War II. When, teachers were gone and they had to get regular people to run kindergartens. And they decided it was easy, rather than sitting them down and trying to drill them, it was a lot easier to let them play and learn that way. I just thought that was a note that I should mention.
That's a perfect note, right? Yeah, and I know that some people are talking about that. I don't know if you saw, but a group of New York City teachers put out an article about outdoor schooling, right? And we're going to get to that as one of the questions that people sent to us. But right, can we think about outdoor schooling as a solution to some of that, and not just teaching outdoors, but playing outdoors and getting children outside, right? I'm also a part of the Global Recess Alliance, and we know that recess is important as we move forward. And this has been traumatic for a lot of children. I don't think we're really touching upon that. It's going to come up in tomorrow's panel, right? But the shift to leave school, to not see your friends anymore, to know that the world is crazy and people are dying, it's traumatic, right? And we know that play helps children deal with trauma, right? So how can we get them more play and more active learning? So
that's the other thing I want to, just one quick thing to add, Denisha, is that with all of this going on, we need to have ways that kids can ask questions, and we don't feel like we need to give them whole lecture answers, where they can do simple, where we can give them simple ways to kind of feel safe and secure and have strategies that they can do to get along as things are happening now. So you can't see your friends. Let's think of something we can do so you can be in touch with your friends. It may not be stay on email all day, but let's write a message, and I'll type it up and drop it off in the mail. I'll write it down and drop it off in the mailbox when I go by your friends, if it's within the neighborhood. Okay, so just many examples of that.
Yeah,
I wanted, is there time for me to make a comment? It's Nancy.
Sure, go ahead.
I really appreciated, all of your comments, Diane, but the two things standing out about don't open schools with surging cases or high infection rates and the need for extra funding. It is occurring to me because I keep thinking, how is this institute this week going to manifest some things that affect policy? And it does occur to me that we could make a statement from Defending the Early Years, putting out criteria like that, where we try, that does give some guidance without telling people what to do, but those are very sane, just let me mention, sane steps. And, your comment that there was no effort to politicize the illness during the Spanish flu, and it's been painful to see the extent to which things have been twisted and distorted because of the politics. And I think it would be helpful if we could think of a couple criteria we could all stand behind that we might be able to get some attention about, that would help people.
Denisha, if I could make one more point, one of the things that I think we should all worry about with this event, this pandemic, is that many older teachers are leaving because they're afraid to go back. And I heard from a friend in South Carolina that 20% of all the state superintendents have announced their retirement. We're going to see an exodus of superintendents, principals, and teachers, unlike, I think, anything we've seen at any previous time, because people feel that no one has their back, that they are being ordered to return to school in unsafe conditions without any planning. And right now, if Congress were to pass a package offering money, it wouldn't get there in time for anyone to do any planning anyway. Schools are going to open theoretically in just a few weeks. And so if they pass funding and it's available in the middle of September, it's kind of late in the day. And I think that one of the long-term things I worry about is how will we replenish the ranks of educators? So I throw that out there for something for you to think about.
Thank you so much, Diane. I really appreciate that. I know everybody wants to chime in, but let's get to our next question and then we can think about it from there. So I want to turn to Michelle Strader-Gunnarsson, who is our first grade teacher in Chicago, a longtime first grade teacher, and also a member of the DEY Advisory Board. So Michelle, you experienced this as a teacher, as many teachers did, the impact of how schools had to close. So I wondered if you can talk a little bit about how were teachers prepared to transition to remote schooling, and how can we prepare teachers for a hybrid return to school, right? A lot of teachers are going to return in a hybrid way. Some might have to go in person, some might not, but we know that it's not going to be like it was before. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. I have a lot.
I'm not sure. Did we lose Michelle's audio?
I think something happened.
Michelle, can you hear us?
And in doing this, I want to do an exercise with all of you. It's called Warm Wind Blows. And so it's something that I say pertains to your life. You're going to do this on your screen. A warm wind blows, for example. A warm wind blows if your name begins with M. You will go like this. A warm wind blows if you can't wait to go safely back to school. That should be all of us in our screens, right? That was the very first activity I did with my students online. And why that brings me hopefulness is that every time we met in a class meeting, at the end of our meeting, they wanted to do warm wind blows as a way of checking in and as a way of being sure that we're all doing fine. And so the hopefulness part of it was that children were wanting to have routine and we're still wanting to have structure. And so the other thing that it taught me is that if I'm going to do this work well, I have to adhere to my principles. And the first one that we need to be thinking about is how much of all of this can children still be doing through play? Then also understanding that children need to interact with others still, and that children learn best when directly working with materials in real life. Now, the other thing that Diane brought up for us, that remote learning does not need to be screen-based. And so in all of my working with the children, I kept thinking last spring, is there a way that this can be done in a real child-oriented method? You know who I went back to look to? I went to Mary Beretta Lorton and Math Their Way, and thinking about, could the children have those two-sided counters, shake them up, roll them out on their table, and write the equations that they were seeing in front of them? I was also thinking about my fellow Chicago teachers who were being so creative. That's another hopefulness we have here. Our teaching force is creative and adaptive. I want to tell you a story about my friend Amy Liss. She teaches a blended special ed preschool program. And she had a grant for a bird watching unit in quarantine. In their homes, every child had binoculars and bird identifying books and art materials. And 3- and 4-year-olds were exploring from their windows with her what they were seeing outside. So let's remember how creative we are. Let's remember how adaptive we are. But also, we need to have generosity in this. One of the things I learned being ejected into this new world of teaching is that all of a sudden we're in each other's homes, and that we are going to have to find a way to be careful with each other's boundaries and each other's schedules. Let's be mindful that we don't perpetuate that super teacher narrative and work ourselves to a point where we can no longer function or we burn out in this situation. I also wanted to talk about overscheduling children, because if we're developmentally appropriate teachers, we would not overschedule children in our classes. We would be giving choice, we would be giving breaks. Let's work against any type of overscheduling that we see happening for children. I would like to give you an example. One of my parents is an engineer, and she was reconfiguring her factory so that the workers could all be there. What an incredible task for her. But she could not have her child on a conference during my regular work days. So I met with them after 4 o'clock for his reading period with me. But I started at 9. I think we need to remember that we still have real lives, but we also can adapt to what our children's needs. The other thing that I learned is that we have to allow each other to make mistakes in this. I thought about how I was teaching children with much younger parents who were so technologically advanced, and I worried every time that I got on my class meetings, was I going to make a mistake? Was it going to work? What was going to be happening there? And I had to get used to making my own mistakes. One of the biggest things I got used to was only doing one take if I was doing an instructional video for children. We are not polished professionals in the entertainment field. I don't believe in teachers as entertainers or the sage on the stage anyway. So I had to give myself with a lot of room in that. Also, when we look at this hybrid model we're going to be getting into, we're going to have to be patient with our children too. We're going to have to understand what technology are they going to need to have in order to be able to participate. I did a math riddle game with children where I wanted them to answer in the chat. Well, just like we would plan any good lesson plan, I had to incorporate the technology that the children were going to need to have in order to participate fully and wholly. I also found that I needed to teach the parents how common mistakes are for young children. They haven't ever seen our teaching lives, and all of a sudden our teaching lives are right there in their homes. I had one parent, when I was teaching a small reading group, sit next to her child and give her child all the answers. And when I said, oh goodness, there needs to be just one teacher here, and actually we need to give her some time, the mother explained to me how much she was hurting that her child wasn't in school and how much she wants her child to succeed. And that was a perfect time for me to explain to her that early childhood educators are used to children making a series of mistakes that are less wrong until they understand something. What a teachable moment we have for each other. What an openness of heart to start understanding how hard this is for all of us. And so more than likely, we're going to have some virtual schooling, and we're going to have to understand what that hybrid model looks like. I went into my classroom the other day and I looked all around at all of the beautiful things I have for children to play with, and all of the ways that I help children make choices and be active in our classroom. And I felt like I had Maria Montessori over my shoulder, and that she was telling me about how she worked with children in Rome and how she worked with children in an urban setting. And I'm thinking that she used work mats and special spaces for children. She helped them build routines. Think of all the routines about hygiene and health we're going to need to teach children. But also she was very, very mindful of building in young children a need for independence. I think we can think that way, helping children with their space, helping children with routines, helping children with building independence. Let's bring Erickson into this. If we don't do this at this time with young children, we have that period of industry versus shame and guilt. And I do believe we can teach children to be industrious about their own care and keeping. So I'm making choices about what's most important to me in this moment. And I always want to choose play first and highlight that. I am hoping that to help parents take pictures of their children playing, take pictures of their children's block structures at home. If a child has made a beautiful artwork, send it to me. And I as a teacher want to respond to that as strongly as I would a well-read book or a well-written story. Let's make sure that what we highlight and spotlight and encourage is the play going on at home. Let's tie back to that, because what do we want? We want the well-being of children. We can teach everybody the small parts of what they need to learn when they come back with us, but we might not be able to restructure their attitudes and feelings about school and learning. So what was most...
Thank you. That's just, yeah, you said so much. I hate to stop you, but I know you're going to keep going, but I really love the point about letting kids, the progression of wrong answers, right? That's so powerful, because that's where the learning happens. It doesn't happen when someone tells you what to say or gives you the right to happen. It happens when you don't get it right, and then you try it again, and then you think through, and then so that's so beautiful. And thank you so much for that as well.
I'm going to say one thing on the tail of that. That's such a profound early childhood point. I just want to underscore it. I'm so appreciative that you said it, because we're in an era now where people think there's a right way to say letters and a right way to say numbers, and they teach the end product to kids. Michelle, I really appreciated the way you were talking about teaching. I always use that word, instead of mistakes, that word approximations. Because when we look at kids, it's so thrilling, because we see them going through a process of getting closer and closer to a final answer, but that whole process is important. The final answer is like the frosting on the cake. It's how they go through it. And when we understand that and we observe it and keep noticing it and supporting it as it goes along, they end up knowing how to read and how to count. But they've constructed an understanding of these things like literacy and math and all other subjects in a very long, slow process. So like one size does not fit all. Each person is in this process of building knowledge for him or herself. So also, I just wanted to know, I don't know if there's time, but I know a lot of cities have had trouble with getting computers to lots of kids and enough broadband, and a family with 5 kids with 1 computer. And so in a city like Chicago, have you dealt with those impediments?
Oh, certainly we have. And we did, at my school, we were able to get Chromebooks to all of the children. But we don't have widespread internet usage in Chicago, so pay for it individually. Other cities do have Wi-Fi access for all citizens, but I'm part of the leadership of the Chicago Teachers Union, and there's one.
I think we lost you a little bit there, Michelle. Sound problem. Okay. Yeah, we're going to have to stop for a second because you're having a little sound trouble, Michelle, but hopefully we can get that and get you back so that we can hear you clearly. So yes, definitely the technology issue is big. Let's get to our next question to Jim St. Clair. How can early childhood teachers hold on to their values regarding child development and best practices in this era of online schooling? I think Michelle touched upon her way of doing that as well, but I wanted to know if you can offer more ideas, because as we're seeing in the chat, people want to know, right? One person said in a school district, the teachers are told to do running records, kindergarten assessments, academic unit instruction online, right? And that's, you didn't want to do that in person. You definitely don't want to do it online, right? So as you know, as teachers are thinking about teaching online, how do we help them hold on to those core values that play and those other things that they know children really need?
Thank you, Denisha. I want to thank DEY for this opportunity, and also you, Denisha, for all the hard work. I hope you get some R&R when this is over. I want to take a moment to commend the educators that I've been in touch with, because they've demonstrated incredible flexibility, resourcefulness, optimism, and sacrifice. And I say sacrifice because I interviewed a lot of teachers, and some examples, a former kindergarten student of mine who's teaching in Boston sent his wife and his daughter to a farm in Western Massachusetts so that he could teach, be safe, and deliver food from the school to the homes. a music teacher who used her own money to put in special Wi-Fi and to hire a technology expert to help her. A nephew in Queens who's teaching middle school, and in spite of all the support that school has, he's working 10-hour days, and he still doesn't feel like he's getting to the kids who need it the most. And a pre-K teacher who told me that he really misses sharing in the community, that celebrating somebody's first lost tooth or the training wheels coming off their bike. We've just gone through one of the most powerful moments in the history of education. Here in Massachusetts, it began ironically on Friday the 13th when everything closed. It was an incredible shock. There's a word in Spanish, el choque, which means it's a big shock and then you got to look around on what to do. Teachers had no choice. Their response was instant. For the first 2 weeks, in my experience, the administrators were scratching their heads and teachers were making up stuff as they went along, very resourcefully. I think in terms of the online learning, they've been extraordinarily clever. Many examples of teachers turning what is a two-dimensional experience of the screen into as close as they could to 3D. For example, a teacher talking about something and saying, take a few minutes, take your clipboard and go to the window and look outside and draw what you can and come back. Michelle gave great examples of that. But they were making the best of it. You know, they were using everything they could with their resourcefulness to make it more than just online. A couple of quick disclaimers. I'm retired, but I retired in 2013, but I've been subbing since then in my district. I love working in colleagues' classrooms who I never get to spend time with. I have a kid still in college, so the money helps. And it's also joyous, you know, because I don't have any homework. But I have not lived the stress through this of working from home and trying to teach kindergarten kids. I'm going to talk about values and professional values. And in my case, I was lucky that I was brought up in a time when maybe because in deference to a man or maybe because of the places where I interned and stuff, but I've never had my values put against the wall. Of course, I've had to compromise things, but I've never really had to surrender them. And the third one is that I was expelled from kindergarten. I know that was talked about. I don't remember it. My mother says they sent me home because I was too active after about 2 weeks. I bring them back in first grade. She had 3 younger kids at home, so she was happy to have a pair of hands. But boy, I would love to see the video. I would love to know what went on. Everyone has personal values. They're your family, your community, your spirituality, whatever. Those are yours. Professionally, we all have core values. I know DEY has a mission statement that they're fighting for just, equitable, and quality early learning for all. And all teachers tend to develop something that is their core values. And if you don't, then you really need to think about what's really important to you. I know one thing that I always kept in mind was try and find out what every kid is a master of and celebrate that. You have from September to June to do that. Right now, we're in a situation where societal values are really screwed up. Everything is this duality. You're a red state, you're a blue state, mask, no mask, schools open, schools closed, everything is yes or no. And we as teachers know, we know about nuance. We know about compromise. We know that, you know, if you come up against the wall, then you got to go around it. You got to find another path. And one of the things I did when the shutdown came was talk to a lot of parents and a lot of teachers. And some of their reactions were, they were very proud of what they did on the fly. I could give examples all day, but I think the example of people really trying to make the screen as interactive as they possibly could and get kids moving around is the best example. There were universal agreement on things. It was universally agreed by everyone I talked to that this was not ideal. And we must do whatever we can at some point without endangering people to get kids back to real classrooms. That the learning that's so important can't all go on the screen. Somebody already alluded to this, but we learned, everyone learned that there are incredible disparities. They were so starkly highlighted during the closure and during the whole pandemic. So much depends on your locality, the medical situation in your town, the home dynamics of what you can accomplish in this online learning. I was talking to a single mother in rural North Carolina the other day by phone, and her school system's response was they sent the school buses around with a packet of worksheets for her 6-year-old daughter to do, and they did that every week until they were using too much gas, so they just brought a big box of papers, and that was her online learning. Compare that to some private schools that I've read about where seamlessly they went to incredible technology and were able to do a whole lot. The last one, which really I've thought about a lot, is the fear that of the acceptance of this, that a lot of people who aren't educators will say, oh, this is so efficient. My own son said to me, this is the future of learning, Dad. This makes sense. And I know I have a freshman, senior in college. A lot of his stuff will be online. But it's being touted as such. And it aligns so well with the dreaded business model of education. And I always try and remind myself that children are not widgets. You know, it's more than the business model. It's their full lives, their whole childhood. The hardest part is still to come. The story's only half over. Right now, we're confronted with one of the most complicated educational decisions in decades, what it will look like. And it's being done on local levels all over the country. And I know that what it will be is meticulously put together, constructed piece by teachers, school committees, unions, government, business, medical professionals, custodians, parents, the teachers themselves. And I know today my district came out and said that there will be some live school going on, especially for the youngest kids. And I just want to caution everyone that the hardest part is still to come. But it's extremely important to know what your values are and to stick with them as best you can. I hope that was sufficient. Thanks for listening.
That was excellent, Jim. Thank you so much. You definitely gave us a lot to think about and holding on to those values. You know, I've been teaching online college courses for over 4 years now. I was part of a training grant at the college I was at the time that said, faculty, do you want to transfer your classes online? Go through this year-long process. So I had a year to learn how to do it, and for a couple courses, and got trained, and I got paid to do it. And now I've been teaching those courses. So yeah, I think it's great for older students. It's a great way to access materials, right? But I couldn't imagine doing it on the fly, right? From March 13th to what did they have, like a week maybe to then rush into it, like as you said, and then doing it for a younger age group. No, it's for college students, graduate students, and most college students don't enjoy it, right? Because it's so weird for them, right? But I can see if they want that. But third graders, second graders, first graders, like the thought of even doing that, it would have scared me to no end, right? Because I just wouldn't feel like it's not the same, right? It's not the same skills to prepare for that. So thank you.
I was at one webinar where somebody suggested, I made a comment that imagine trying to do kindergarten with social distancing, and the moderator had to read it out because everyone thought it was so funny, just the image of trying to do kindergarten with social distancing, but we're going to have to figure out something.
Yeah, but even doing kindergarten on Zoom, one of my friends, she's a kindergarten teacher in New York City, Lagann Garcia, her colleagues at her school had to make a Zoom video to go over the do's and don'ts of on Zoom for the kids. Because why would 5-year-olds know how to engage on Zoom, right? So they all did their videos in their windows and of them doing things. Oh, but maybe I shouldn't eat while we're talking, and maybe I should do this, right? And so it was really funny that they actually had to make a Zoom video to show kids, right? Because it's definitely a challenge, but it helped the kids to kind of get used to that kind of setting as well. Does anyone, we have about a minute, want to give a brief response to Jim's question and to what Jim shared with us?
I can say something quickly. I really appreciated your comments so much, Jim, all of them. I've had that fear when all of this started. I had that fear that, oh no, everyone's going to technology and online learning and it's going to get solidified and it'll be the future, like you said. But something I've noticed is that in things I read and in all the parents I talk with, they're all saying it's not adequate. They don't like it. Their kids aren't happy. They're not getting their needs met. So I've sort of thought it was a silver lining, if you will, of people realizing, no, that isn't education. Because their kids aren't happy, is what most people are telling me. It's younger kids, kindergartners and first graders. But even one of my grandkids is in 5th grade and he hates it. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm hearing the same thing, Nancy. I have a good friend with 2 girls who I believe are in like 3rd and 1st grade, and they're I thought they said no. They want to go back. They don't care if it's 1 day a week, 2 days a week.
Yeah.
They don't like it at all, and to me they seem like the type of self-directed learners who would be okay, but it's not. They're just not enjoying it, and I was surprised. I thought some students would be like, this isn't so bad, but it's definitely. And we have a survey, and we'll show some of the results we're doing. Defending the Early Years has been doing a survey for parents and teachers of young children, and the survey results are showing that too. And we'll be sure to share some of that with you tomorrow as well. It's not finished yet, but we have some of that. But yeah, a lot of parents are saying the kids themselves and the teachers are saying the kids themselves don't like it at all.
Yeah.
Denise, one thing I forgot to mention, a lot of teachers said to me that they feel like the parents are going to come back with a lot more empathy for the teachers, that the time they dedicated to communicating with parents was great. They really established relationships, but that the parents have realized what it's like to deal with numerous young children, and they're going to be much more understanding.
Yeah, and I think that's because I've heard a lot of kids say, my parent's a terrible teacher. And it's funny, I hate to say it, but I've heard this of parents who are teacher educators, who are college professors, their kids saying, you're not a good 1st grade teacher, which makes sense, right? I teach college students. It's been 16 years since I taught the little ones. I might be a little rusty, and I might not do it in the best way. All right, I know we can go on, but I do want to bring in our last panelist. And a lot of this, there's a lot of talk about the online schooling and how do we deal with it? And so my first thought, if we're going to have a panel talking about screen time and online schooling, we're going to bring in Josh Golan from the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood, because this is really their wheelhouse and what they've been doing. So welcome, Josh. Our question to you, our last question before we get to the Q&A is, how does the Campaign for Commercial-Free Childhood plan to respond to the increase in online schooling and screen time as a result of this need for hybrid teaching and online teaching as we struggle to reopen schools?
Thank you so much, Denisha. And, it's such a pleasure to be here. DEY is one of my absolute favorite organizations. And I hope if there are new people to DEY that they get really involved, because you guys are the best. But I want to start by acknowledging that there's a tension for those of us who do work around screen time issues between advocating for our ideals and in harm reduction. In an ideal world, young children would be on screens very sparingly and only in the presence of an adult. Either they would be watching something with an adult or they might be Skyping with a grandparent, but that would be how young children were on screens. And as I said, it would be very rare. In the real world, kids are on screens a ton, even before the pandemic, and most often alone. So we know that preschool kids are averaging about 3 hours of screen time per day. This is pre-pandemic. That 10-year-olds are averaging about 5 hours a day, not including anything they're doing for schoolwork. So it's a ton of time, much more than that's ideal. So there's this tension between, do we say what's best for children, or do we try and just reduce what we see as harmful? And that tension has never been more pronounced. Screen time has exploded from already concerningly high pre-pandemic levels. Many children have been deprived of the ability to play with other kids for months, not getting the movement or creative play. And the thing that they need the most right now is that wonderful play-based preschool that Nancy started us off by talking about at the beginning of the session. To move freely, to touch everything, to feel safe, to connect with their peers, and to play and play and play some more with the guidance of skilled educators. And I think, as Nancy very powerfully said at the beginning of this, that's an experience in normal times that's not available to most children. And now with the pandemic, it's almost available to almost no one. And meanwhile, educators are exhausted, they're fearful, they're angry at being asked to do things that aren't safe. And so in this environment, I think it would be very easy to put our ideals on hold. In fact, it almost seems cruel to talk about what's best for children when what's best is out of reach for so many. It's tempting just to talk about harm reduction, how we can get kids a little less screen time and put our ideals on hold for the time being. But we can't do that. We absolutely can't do that. While we have to focus on what's possible at this moment, we can never stop articulating what children actually need and what's best for them. And there's at least two reasons why we need to do that. One is to set our ideals aside, is to let policymakers off the hook. If we were a society that cared about children, reopening schools would have been the #1 priority. That means we wouldn't have opened restaurants, bars, casinos, all the other ridiculous things that are open right now that shouldn't be. We would have kept those closed to get the pandemic all under control so that kids could go back to school in a safer environment. And as Diane Ravitch so eloquently pointed out, we would have given schools the resources that they needed to reopen. Resources to make safe spaces safer, to acquire more space, and most importantly, to reduce student to teacher ratios, because the way we can make schools safest is to have more adults there and to keep kids in smaller groups. But of course, we didn't do any of that, right? We bailed out the airlines and we gave nothing to our schools. So we cannot ignore that that's the context that we're operating in. The very prescribed choices that we're dealing with right now are the direct result of policy choices that have already been made, that shouldn't have been made, and that we can never allow to be made again. So we can't put our ideals on hold for that reason. The second reason that we can't put our ideals on hold is because we are at a crossroads right now when it comes to kids and educational technology. Jim mentioned it. His son says that maybe this is the future of schooling, is for all online all the time. Jeb Bush had an op-ed in the Washington Post positing the same exact thing. Andrew Cuomo has been talking about similar things, about how can we increase online learning even in normal times. This is something that's across the aisle. People are talking about. The ed tech marketers, this is a dream for them. This is what, a pandemic that forces everybody onto educational technology, when that's the only way that many kids can learn right now. This is a dream. And so the other reason why we cannot put our ideals on hold and not talk about what children need in what they really need, what's best for them, is because what we are advocating for now and what we are debating and what we are fighting for right now is not just next year. This is the future of education. And we know from experience, we know a few things. First of all, we know that just giving kids technology does not lessen the achievement gap. That we know that, for years we have been sold the idea that giving kids a one-to-one device was going to close the gap between rich and poor kids, and that absolutely has not happened. And we know that not right now, right? Technology is going to be marketed as safe. If you have to open a preschool right now, if you are forced to open your preschool and you need to keep kids stationary, to keep them from bumping into each other, from getting close to each other, there is no better tool to do that besides restraints than an iPad. If you don't want kids running all over the room, you give them an iPad. You will then only have one thing to clean. You don't have to clean blocks and everything else. You just have to disinfect that iPad. So that is a very real danger. But it's not just a danger for this year. It's a danger because we know that when schools invest in technology, we see technology creep. It doesn't just they get the iPads because they think that they're going to help with math instruction. And then they say, wow, we have the iPads. Why don't we use them for literacy? Why don't we use them for foreign language? Why don't we use them to watch videos when it's rainy during recess and kids can't go outside? And then before you know it, decisions that were made on a subject by subject basis, like, oh, we think this is the best way to teach this one individual subject or do this one individual activity. Before you know it, the entire day is on screens or a lot of it. And that's not what's best for children. So we have to keep advocating for our ideals because this moment is critical for the future of education. So practically, one of the things that means is we need to ensure that investments in ed tech are limited to things that will most impact and help teachers reach students during the pandemic but not open them up to unlimited uses that are going to continue beyond the pandemic. If schools schools should not be getting into contracts with ed tech vendors, multi-year contracts, because that's what they are being pressured to do, because the ed tech vendors see this as an opportunity. So I think the question was what CCFC is doing about all of this. So let me tell you quickly some of the things that we're doing. Since the pandemic started, we have been doing a series of webinars for parents and for educators about how to limit screen time during the pandemic. We've been fortunate enough to feature Nancy Carlson-Page in a couple of those. We have 3 more coming up this summer. One is for parents of school-age children, one is for teachers of school-age children, and one is for preschool and early education teachers. We are going to continue to do those things. I talked about articulating ideals. We will have a statement coming out in a couple of weeks that lays out some very basic principles that we will be asking leading educators and child development experts to sign on to. That makes very clear that no matter where school is, whether it's in person, whether it's hybrid, whether it's at home, that there are some very simple principles, like about respecting children's privacy, about encouraging offline play no matter where school is, and other things that we will be putting out there, that we will be sharing with policymakers. We also, like DEY is forming, we have work groups within our organization. We have something called the Children's Screen Time Action Network, and we have an early childhood work group, and we have a work group called Screens in Schools, which focuses on older children and their education. Both of those work groups are working like crazy to produce resources to help people think more creatively about what remote and hybrid learning looks like. It was so wonderful to hear Michelle and Jim talk about all the ways that that remote learning does not have to equal being on the screen all the time, or that the screen can become more 3-dimensional. Because I think we heard a lot about really creative ways today of using screens, but the fact of the matter is, in many, many schools, in many environments, the ways that screens are being used is either A, to just replicate the lecture of a classroom on Zoom with older children, or to have kids on programs that are choosing their, what math programs, like an app where they're doing math problems on an app, and it's very gamified, and it's very, so much of the ed tech that's happening is not the teachers are on the other side of the screen and they're directing and they're helping kids, find things in their house and bring them back or observe to them. But the kids are just on their device. It's just them and the algorithm and the content that they're consuming, and the teacher and their peers are not really part of the equation. So we need to help educators. We need to get people like Michelle and Jim and their wonderful ideas in the hands of more educators. So that's one thing that we're going to be doing is our website will be a repository for those types of ideas for people to share and give ideas about what different types of learning could look like. I mean, when I think about hybrid learning, I think hybrid is probably the option that most kids will be in next year, some combination of home and in school. And if kids are in hybrid and they're going to have more screen time when they're at home, they should have practically none when they're in the building, when they're in school. The schools should be using my daughter's school is going to be a week on and a week off. I really hope that they use the week on when they're in school to prepare kids for that week off, to get them some materials, to get them activities, to get them started on independent projects that they can work on that don't all involve screens. And then the last thing I'll say is it's not just ed tech that is keeping kids on screens more than ever. Kids are having more entertainment screen media. At the same time, they're having more educational, more screen media for educational purposes. And the combination of that just means they are on screens almost all the time. So one of the things that we've launched is something called Screen Free Saturdays, which is a chance for families to unplug for a day every week. And connect with each other and turn off all the noise about COVID and all the upsetting news that we're all consuming 24/7, and give ourselves a break and really connect with our families. And also, I think it's a great opportunity for families to really assess, do we have a problem with technology right now? Because if you are jonesing, 6 hours into your 24-hour media fast and you're going off to the bathroom to check your phone and cheat, there's probably a problem there and something that you need to think about in what you're modeling for your children. So those are just some of the things that we're doing. We really believe that we need to bring as many people together, both to advocate for the ideals and to help each other share resources to do this better for what's coming next year. And we believe that working together, we can make this better. And I'll just say one last thing. I think what Jim said at the end about parents having so much more empathy for teachers is so true. And to me, it's one of the reasons why the powers that be are so anxious to turn this into a fight of parents versus teachers right now. Because the power that we have when parents and teachers unite is one where we can get a society where children come before airlines and other corporations.
Josh, thank you. Oh my goodness. I wasn't going to stop you for 1 second because that's just, yes. But that last point, don't let them pit parents against teachers. I know some parents are frustrated because online schooling didn't work for their child. And when they hear a teacher saying, I don't want to go back till I'm safe, they hear, I don't care about your child, I'm not going back. And that's not what they're saying. They're saying, I know online teaching doesn't work, but we can't rush into this. We can't put your child at risk and your family at risk and my family at risk. And we have to come up with something more workable. So thank you. I think that's so important, right? If we don't get that point, we're gonna miss that. So I'll stop, let someone else respond to what Josh said, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Nobody?
Go for it, Jim.
Oh, Jim.
No. I had nothing to say. I was just commenting. I was talking to myself. Nobody. When I grew up, I'll say this much. When I grew up, I didn't watch television. We played in the street and we played in the schoolyard with kids from 6 to 16. Do you have any idea how many social skills in terms of negotiating, bully prevention was a pair of sneakers and you could run away? All that stuff when kids were stuff on screens is gone. They don't get that. And I feel bad for them. I'm glad I grew up when I did. It's great to be old. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think I was like the last generation. Like we got up and we left the house and we didn't come back on till the street light came on. And my mom had no idea where we were and she'll never know to this day. And that was the joyous thing of my growing up. The kind of confident person who can do things like I can move to a new city and I can travel the country because I know what it's like to be in charge of myself. And that's
Josh, this is Nancy. Those were powerful comments. Thank you so much. You didn't specifically mention online pre-K, did you?
I didn't.
Okay, because otherwise you mentioned a lot, so I might have missed it. But I just want to flag that we've been concerned about that, and we've collaborated with Josh's organization, CCFC, on this now for a couple of years. But we're worried. We were worried pre-pandemic, and we're worried now about the growing trend of states offering online preschool education for kids as a substitute for in-person quality pre-K. And they're kind of primed for it. Parents are primed to accept it because of this whole ed reform climate we live in that redefined education to mean things you could learn from rote learning on a screen. And it's been an upward battle, and it's part of all the comments you're making, Josh, but it's something that concerns us because more and more states have adopted it. And it's something because of budget, it's so cheap that, legislators are drawn to it because they can say they're offering pre-K when all they do is supply a computer to a family and a bunch of rote learning exercises for 4-year-olds to do. It's been a big worry, and I've worried that it's going to increase and get a stronger foothold as because of the pandemic. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Josh.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. I forgot to mention online preschool. So online preschool is something that DEY and CCFC have been very concerned about for the past couple of years. There has been a big push, particularly by one group called Waterford Upstart, to get public funds in order to expand their online preschool program. And of course, they couch it in very benign, even admirable terms that this is, not everybody has access to high quality preschool. So we're going to get kids a preschool experience that they otherwise wouldn't have access to. But of course, just the term online preschool is ridiculous, and it's nowhere near what kids need, and even worse, it's a distraction from the critical fight for online universal pre-K that is going on right now. So it's a way for legislators to say, look, we have an option for all families now, and we barely spent any money, so shouldn't everybody be happy? But parents should not be happy. Early childhood people should not be happy. And so one of the things that DEY and CCFC is we have an action where you can go to our website and send a letter to your legislators in your state, asking them not to devote any public funding for this online preschool. As you can imagine, the pandemic has led to a huge push by this upstart program to say, look, we already know how to do safe remote learning with kids that age, and so it's really something that is incredibly concerning, and the more people can weigh in that, the better.
Yeah, and I know people are in the chat. It's an abomination. Thank you, Jim. Like it's the worst thing you can imagine, and it's not even preschool. It's we're going to deny your child a true preschool education and give them a tablet. And if you think about it, right, what a lot of parents are frustrated about school saying we're going to be hybrid or we're going to be virtual is that it doesn't solve the childcare problem. Right? Like they can't go to work if their kid is on well, neither does online preschool, right? You're telling parents that sit here and work on a tablet with your child is somehow better than having a year of preschool education, right? It doesn't, you can't go to work and leave your kid on the tablet, right? So this idea that it's not doing anything, but I wanted to bring up something that you mentioned, Josh, and I think Diane said it in her comments in the chat, was that, it's this idea that certain kids become consumers of technology while other kids get to be producers of technology, right? And it's the idea that when we go back, ed tech is going to be for poor Black and brown children, while other kids are going to get, they're already getting it, right? Their parents are talking about forming pods and getting tutors. Every day I get an email from a parent saying, do you have any graduates who will come teach my child at home individually? Because I'm not sending my kid back to public school. And what they imply is that they have the means for this, right? So we already see that happening, right? So as the schools push the online learning, and that's going to be for a certain group of kids who don't have any other choice. And it's not going to be for other kids who can opt out of that in a way. And that's really problematic that we're seeing as well.
Yeah, I would just say,
Go ahead.
I would just say to that, Michelle mentioned at the beginning about the importance of getting everyone access, and I couldn't agree more. In 2020, even not in a pandemic, internet access should be a human right, and particularly in a pandemic, it's essential to survival. But we need to understand that access alone, what the kids in low-income communities will be on is the cartoon-based math games and rote reading exercises that don't really, where they don't learn, they just learn how to press buttons and memorize, and where the games are literally designed to keep them on the screen as long as possible, because that's one of the things that these things are designed to do, is train us to be on our screens. And the kids in wealthier school districts will be using technology in much more interesting and creative ways. So access, yes, but it can't stop there.
And that's the goal for some people, right? And that's what's going to happen. Like we've talked about this kind of interaction, which is, it's challenging, but I think the face-to-face, right? Getting that in a real time, and then you can talk to a child. You can actually play with a child. A child could be playing and you could be talking about their play this way, right? But what we see is a lot is they're sent to those computer screens, those like Brain Pop. Many of you probably know Brain Pop. I used it when I was a tutor. I sat next to an 8-year-old and I took him through Brain Pop and we did it together, right? But now that's going to be a kid's 3 hours, right? They're going to be stuck on a program like that where it's just a computer screen telling them what to do and watching videos and not getting that interaction, where at least this Zoom, this way of video communication is at least real time and it's at least better, but we know that that's not going to be for all children, right? And so that's something that we definitely want to address. We get to the point, we have about 20 minutes left. We want to get to some questions and answers. I know people have been putting in the questions in the Q&A. We're not going to get to them all. We also asked some of you to submit some questions earlier on our Google Doc. So let's start with some of those questions, and then we'll get to Catherine, who will pick a couple of the questions in the Q&A. But one of the questions that came up early from people who registered was this idea of social distancing in young children. It's a lot to really think about, right? Should we what do you suggest? What do you recommend to someone in thinking of it being developmentally appropriate to practice social distancing with young children? Or is it, can it be developmentally appropriate? I think is another way to frame that question. And I'll just, leave that open to see if any of the panelists wish to respond.
I think the only way you could do it would be to structure things very well ahead of time, so that kids were in small groups. I think Diane referred to this, kids in small groups, more teachers, separate groups, keep them separate. I have 8 grandkids, but the youngest one is 4, Max, and he came over. We were on the back porch with his parents. They had prepped him completely. They were all in a mask. They had told him how he couldn't hug me and my husband Doug, and he had to keep a distance. And it was a painful situation. I never want to go through again. I felt so sorry for Max. He just spent his whole time trying to figure out how to get over there and give a hug, how to get on Doug's lap, how to hug me. We drew a chalk line on the deck. We live in the city, it's a small little deck, but we drew a chalk line to show him not to go past it. And he just spent his whole inventive time trying to figure out how to get to us. And it was really hard. And it just hit me after that. I'm never doing this again. And it's not a working thing. Kids don't have the ability to self-regulate around a rule like that with their bodies when they're 4. So the only way, I don't recommend even attempting social distancing with little kids. It doesn't make sense. Maybe you can start thinking about it when they start to be more logical thinkers around 6, 7, 8 years old, but not younger. So I would say you've got to figure it out in a more structural way of how you organize small groups, keep kids separate in a physical way, and have a teacher in their small group. It's the only thing I think that could possibly work.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nancy. I said the same thing to someone, and I know it's hard. I know Cindy Lagann is an early childhood director who's going to be on our panel on Thursday. She had to reopen her center, to serve people, and she talked about that. Right, they're just in smaller groups. Right, they're just in smaller groups and limiting the contact between adults and children. But that way, children in a group of 6 or 7, they can interact with each other. And, and at the center at my college, at Sarah Lawrence College, we're thinking about being outdoors as much as possible, right? And so that leads to the next question. Of course, you can come back to this question, but the next question was this idea of outdoor learning, right? As I mentioned earlier, a group of educators in New York City talked about this idea of outdoor learning. And someone also submitted this question about what are your thoughts about advocating for outdoor play at elementary schools while states and school districts are kind of figuring out. I've seen the New York City plan, the DOE plan for schools, and a lot of it is if you're not fully remote, then you'll be like on and off multiple days, depending how big the school is. Like there's all these graphs and charts. But the idea is that if you're only in school 1 or 2 days a week, the other days you're at home online learning. And I'm wondering, could we think about outdoors as a solution to that? Because I don't think that just staying home and being on the computers we talked about is the only option, right? And how can we utilize and think about outdoor play in that way?
Denisha, can I take that?
Sure.
I know years ago when I taught in the preschool kindergarten, every year we had a week of outdoor school. We'd take everyone, we'd get on the bus, we'd go to this big lot and we'd dig for worms and do everything all day. I grew up in New York City, and depending on what school you had in your neighborhood, the schoolyard was set up in such a way that the games the kids played were developed around the architecture of the building. The school I was teaching in Cambridge moved to a much smaller school with a tiny playground that had no play equipment. Now, when my kids are outside playing, the more they can be independent and have nothing to do with me, the better. And I have actually scolded kids for walking around reading books. I said, you're out here to play. But I had to wind up coming up with New York City schoolyard games that would keep kids. There's lots of games where you're in a circle and you're throwing the ball across. And you're using your imagination that I never thought of them as pandemic-worthy games. They were fun, but actually, if you do a little research, there are lots of games, and this is better than nothing. I'd rather see kids developing their own play, but there are a lot of games that baseball, you're all over the place. You're not really next to each other. I could go on, but I think it takes a lot of imagination to figure out the things in the schoolyard that are going to work that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an important part. It's outdoor play. I will challenge you. I read outside and I am playing in my mind as I read a book, right? It's not imaginative for me, but that's just me and my love of books, right? But as I talk to the teachers in New York City who are thinking about outdoor play, outdoor learning, they're not talking about, moving your classroom outside and just teaching outside. But it's this idea that we should be facilitating play outdoors and activities and experiments and that hands-on, movement and things that kids can do and not and there's learning happening and all that. That's what we need to remember. There's a ton of learning happening and all that, but it's not the teacher directed, standards based instruction that a lot of people are used to. And I think that's a big part of it, right? That this play should be, it should open up. This outdoor learning should open up the possibilities for play as well. All right, Catherine is going to come on now and share a couple questions from the Q&A. So I'll welcome her to do that. And then again, we'll just open it up and see who would like to address the question.
Hello, everyone. So my first question, it's from Eric Branholm, and his question is, I'm a pre-K teacher, and this year during remote learning, we did a lot of reflecting on and making drawings about old experiences we had back in the classroom. I would share photos of old trips to the nearby park or work with what we did with the materials in the room. I feel like this helped our students maintain a semblance of community, essential for pre-K, despite not being in the same space. How might we begin to build community in a pre-K classroom if we begin the year with remote learning and we have had no shared experiences together?
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, this is a really great question, but I'll stop and see if somebody else wants to address it.
I've been thinking about how that's going to work. And one of the things that we do have is that in Head Start, we have the intake inventory. I think I'm going to be meeting with parents and children individually and get to know them as much as I can, just like I would if I was teaching preschool and having the parent and the child come sit next to me and get to know one another. And then I think I'm going to have to build shared experiences in small groups. I did not have a lot of success with my whole group learning. I felt like 2 or 3 children getting together. And then my students and their families started putting together play dates for their little small group too. But you're very right. We're going to have to be thinking shared experiences, a lot of what we do in community building.
Yeah, Michelle, one of the things I suggested to some educators I was in a summer class with was to think about, home visits. We always talk about the power of home visits and building that relationship. And I wonder if a socially distant home visit is helpful if you're going to start online, right? Can you come together in that way with the children somehow? Or like you said, the small group meetups, right? I just couldn't imagine when I taught kindergarten and preschool to not have that opportunity somehow to meet with them. So I'm wondering if that's something that teachers can really think about, right? And keep your 6 feet, wear your mask, but at least physically see your teacher and let them physically see you and talk with you a little bit. And do you think that's something that might help, right? Ease this start to virtual learning?
At least I was hoping that maybe my school could set up safe spaces for us to meet in person. I want that open as a possibility.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in the comments, Susan Oxshorn mentioned that, if we're thinking about outdoor learning, we really need to look at some of the models in other countries. Even here in the United States, there's been a push for more fully outdoor learning, but that they're getting that from other countries in Denmark and Norway and other places that really focus on this idea of the good childhood, right? And that part of that is being outdoors. And these are cold countries and they have kids fully outdoors, 24 all the time, day that they're there. And that could definitely happen. I think with the educators in New York City we're working with, how do we get this so that it's equitable? I think someone mentioned the lack of outdoor spaces in certain communities, right? If I was in DC and we were going to do this, I would reach out to DC Parks and Rec because they're in charge of all the outdoor space and bring them in as a partner and really thinking about how do we utilize spaces for outdoor learning and how do we take care of those spaces? Because the first thing you're going to hear from people who maintain outdoor spaces is we don't want those spaces, being trashed by a large group of children out there, right? And so how do we work that? But we want them on our side. We need that as a partnership. So in New York City, who's in charge of maintaining these outdoor spaces? How do we bring them into this partnership? How do we bring in environmental education into this piece if kids are going to be outdoors, right? I think those are all things to consider.
Marie brought up a really good point that we need to consider in terms of equity. I see it as a Chicago teacher, is that children don't often have the right equipment.
Oh, I think we lost your sound for a second there, Michelle. All right, we'll get her.
How about we come back to her
Yeah,
and I'll
go
ask
ahead.
another question.
Mhm.
So we have a couple different questions about the pushing of academics as a result of going online. And I'm going to use one as the primary, as the basis of the question, but we have a few along this topic. So this question is from Renee Dinnerstein and a few others, but I work as an early childhood consultant with pre-kindergarten and kindergarten teachers. In one school where I thought play-based learning was respected, the principal has insisted that the kindergarten teachers follow academic units of study and that they conduct reading, running records, and reading and writing assignments during the time that online instruction was taking place. I don't know how widespread this is happening, but I felt so horrified for the children, their families, and the distraught teachers. I'm not sure of how to deal with this in September. Any ideas? So I think, sorry, so that question should either go to Jim or Michelle.
Renee, you know, this is even live, this stuff was, were pressures on kids that when I started teaching were not there. There was no expectation that you were going to be on level C by the end of kindergarten. I can't imagine doing it online. I mean, half the whole reason for those little reading groups was that you could look carefully at what they were doing, the mistakes they were making, and analyzing them. And I was willing to do that as long as I was able to hold on to my, you know, hour of choice time every day. I can't imagine doing it online, and I think I would say that. I've often told teachers, you know what? If your principal is asking you to do something that's unreasonable, explain to them that you are an early childhood specialist and they are not, and you know what's best for kids. People are reluctant to do that, but really, in some cases, it has to be done.
Michelle?
Well, you guys know I'm a leader in the Chicago Teachers Union, and what I'm going to say is that we use our unions to fight for what we need to. And one of the things we fought for in Chicago was a grading policy that the teachers had the all day. We were having principals asking us for sight word inventories weekly, and we said no and made the grading policy contractual.
On my first year, my tenure year, the evaluation was taken over by the principal of my school, who said his kids needed more worksheets, and I grieved it. And fortunately, that was a time when there was such a thing as an early childhood department, and they backed me up, and they had somebody from there do my evaluation, and they actually believed in what I was trying to do. But a lot of people aren't willing to file a grievance. It's a big, scary thing to a lot of people. I'm very union involved myself, Michelle.
Well, and never do anything alone, right? If you believe this is wrong, get your team of teachers. You know, teachers run the school. Principals think they do, they don't. If your whole school decides they don't want that to go on, you can make it happen.
But the custodians and the secretary are pretty important too. You gotta be friends with them.
It, right? No, but thank you, Michelle. I tell people all the time how, you know, Chicago Teachers Union are on strike and they're talking about play and time for play as part of their negotiation, right? And that's super important, right? We have to demand those things. We saw last year, Brookline, Massachusetts, the teachers, you know, wrote a letter and testified, right? Their kindergarten teacher saying, we can't do this. We need more time for play. And what did they hear from the administrators? Low-income kids, i.e. Black and brown kids, don't need play, they need rigor. And that's the kind of mindset we have to challenge, because not only is that not equitable, it's actually racist. I'm just going to say it. It's flat out racist to think because a kid is low income or Black or brown that they need something that not all children, other children need, right? That is a racist idea that we need to challenge, right? Because that's not true at all.
Denisha, in one of my blogs, I mentioned it's almost like you're preparing one set of kids to be workers in the factory. They're learning discrete skills, and the other kids are making hypotheses. They're sharing their ideas. They're communicating. They're going to be the managers. So it's absolutely racist and classist, and it's tracking.
Yes.
Tracking at 5 years old is what it is.
And we have a long history of that in this education system as well. I will stop. Let's try and squeeze in one more question, Catherine.
Oh, okay. Can I do two? One is super short. And I'll save the short one for last. So the other one has to do with professional development, and how do you have suggestions to help engage teachers virtually when our focus should be relation-based, social emotional learning and play-based learning, not to do the basic skill and drill material like colors, numbers, shapes, etc.
So the question is about professional development for teachers, right?
Yeah, so as a professional development specialist whose job it is to train and support teachers and programs, I'm finding it very difficult to do that virtually.
Yeah, it's hard. At my college, one of my colleagues wanted to do a teacher leadership program. And then when she realized it had to be virtual, she had to really think about that, because that wasn't her plan. She wanted to do 8 hours a day for a couple of weeks in the same room. And the thought of doing that virtually is really, really challenging, right? And so we're rethinking what that looks like. My thinking for professional development is that whatever you want teachers to do, you need to get them to do it themselves. So if you want teachers to promote play, then you need to get them to play themselves. And you need to get them to come up with play activities that they've engaged in themselves so that they understand them and they go through that. And that's really important. And so if I'm doing a professional development virtually on play, I'm going to take time, or I'm going to, turn off your camera and go play for 20 minutes, and then let's regroup and talk about what you just experienced, right? There's got to be this feeling that you don't have to stay on the camera the entire time, right? Sometimes I hide the camera because I don't like looking. I'm not used to staring at myself all the time when I'm talking. It's a really odd thing, right? But can you stop? Can you get out of the virtual, get into something else, get people to do something, and then come back and use this space for communication? And so I think that's part of the online teaching too, and why Josh mentioned this remote schooling was the idea, right? Because remote schooling doesn't equal online learning. It's school that's not happening in the traditional space of schools, right? And it doesn't need to be on a computer all the time. And I understand it. And that takes really orienting our children to that too, right? Students aren't used to being told to go work on this stuff on their own. And because a lot of schools don't prepare them for that. We kind of make them go through hoops and take them through, a process that's very foreign. And now we're going to say, actually, I want you to work on this all week and check in with me on Friday. And we think that's going to be great, but have we prepared them for that role, and have we prepared teachers for their role in that as well too?
All right, I have one last question. It's for Nancy Carlson-Page. What methods do you recommend for teachers who want to work on checking their biases and understand each and every one of their children?
Wow. There are a lot of resources out there to help with this. I started with other colleagues, the Center for Peaceable Schools at Lesley University for years. We did a lot of work on nonviolence, peaceable schools, and racial awareness. It's a long, slow process. It involves a lot of work. There are no tricks. It's not easy. It's a commitment. You could do it a lot of different ways, but exploring one's own attitudes and biases is very, very difficult. It has to happen in a safe place with other people you trust and with some leadership that you have some trust in. And that's the place to start. I don't think we can find techniques for dealing with challenging behaviors of kids from different racial and ethnic groups if we haven't looked at ourselves first and how we're perceiving the behaviors in the first place and understanding them. So it's a lot of work. It occurred to me you could apply for a day mini grant if you want to. I think someone mentioned, I think Denisha, that we have mini grants. And if you look on our website, it could be a place to begin to try to get some money to work with teachers to start exploring biases. That would be step one.
Nancy, for me, the idea of trying to identify for each child what they're master of and celebrate that really allowed me to see every kid as competent, able to learn, and special. And I don't know if that conquers racism, but it put me in touch with all of them much more than if I didn't do that.
Well, that's beautiful, because we're not looking for certain things. We're sort of looking for what does each person do well? How do they contribute to this group? And how, I like that a lot. It's wonderful.
do we have time for one more question, and it would be for Josh?
Sure. Well, if everyone's okay,
last
for
one.
a minute, I will make the closing in 15 seconds. Go.
I'm sorry. So for school starting virtually in the fall, what is your recommendation on screen time for 5 and under? And then I'm done.
You know, I think that's a really difficult question. I think, you know, the goal for school should be to limit school time as much as possible. And what is possible is going to depend a lot on, you know, what the home situation is, you know, whether parents are working from home or essential workers, or whether there's another caregiver available, you know, and the ability of schools to promote offline, you know, offline learning that doesn't from home. And, you know, I think that all we can say, you know, it's hard to, I know everybody wants a magic number of what's the amount of screen time that a kid could get. And all I can say is less is better. And, you know, schools have a lot of goals for the year, and reducing screen time and the amount of time that kids were on this past year has to be one of them. It can't, it's, you know, it's obviously not the only one, but less is more.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Josh. I think that's the most we can say, right? Less is more, and the type of screen use they're going to be doing, right? Like, make sure it's not the same type of passive screen use that really doesn't stimulate the children at all. Wow, that was 2 hours. This was day one. This was super exciting. Thank you all so much. I apologize if we didn't get to your questions, but we continue the conversation tomorrow. We're shifting the focus a little bit. We're talking about childhood trauma in the time of Corona, teachers, families, and community factors. We have an amazing panel lined up. I'll be moderating that one as well, but we'll hear from Takima Bunch-Smith, Duma Jordan, Erica Chastiskas, Diane Levin, and Susan Lynn. So I hope you can join us tomorrow. You'll be getting some emails if you registered, reminding you about what's upcoming. We'll have a survey at the end. We'll talk more about the working groups that we did get as an idea from the Screen Time Action Network, and we'll talk more about getting that kicked off. So thank you all. Thank you, Diane Ravage, Nancy Carlson Page, Josh Golan, Jim St. Clair. Was that everyone? And myself, right? I think
Wow.
No, Michelle.
Thank you so much for being on this panel and for sharing your wisdom. Thank you, everyone who joined and for chatting. We will see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.